He spent his entire career finding missing people. He wore the badge. He carried the weight of protecting a town that trusted him completely. And then, on one quiet summer morning, he became the missing person himself. No struggle. No body. No goodbye. Just a locked car sitting alone at a lake he had no business visiting, and a badge left folded neatly inside, as if he never intended to need it again. This happened not once, but twice. Two law enforcement officers, more than a decade apart, who vanished so completely that even the people trained to solve mysteries for a living could never solve their own. Welcome to the Cold Case Archive. If this is your first time here, stick around, because what you're about to hear only gets stranger from here. Law enforcement is a profession built on risk. Officers face down armed suspects. They testify against violent criminals who remember their faces long after the trial ends. It's a job that asks for a level of personal danger most of us will never have to consider. But sometimes, the danger isn't the job itself. Sometimes, an officer simply walks away from their car, and is never seen again. Today, we're covering two such disappearances. 2 different decades. 2 different states. 2 men who were supposed to be the ones finding answers, who instead became the questions nobody could answer. By the end of this video, we're going to walk through the leading theory in both cases, including who investigators believe may be responsible for one of them. So if you're the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends, you're going to want to stay until the final minutes. Before we dive into the first case, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We post a brand new unsolved case every single week, and if today's video is anything like the ones before it, you're not going to want to miss what comes next. Alright, let's begin. Hinckley Township, Ohio. A small community of around 5,000 people, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and nothing much ever happens. Mel Wiley had served as the town's police chief since 1982. He was well liked around town, not exactly the hard-edged authority figure you'd expect from a chief of police, but an easygoing, congenial man who spent most of his free time at a local donut shop, joking with the owner and the regulars. He was 47 years old. Divorced. No children. Before working in law enforcement, he had actually served as a fingerprint analyst for the FBI and spent time in the United States Army. But everyone who knew him agreed on one thing: being a police chief was never his real passion. Mel Wiley wanted to be a writer. He had already published 1 book of poetry. He wrote a regular column for the local newspaper. And at the time of his disappearance, he was deep into work on his first novel, a murder mystery titled Harvest of Madness, set in a small town in Pennsylvania. He'd apparently started the manuscript, scrapped it, and started over more than once, determined to get it right. He told colleagues he dreamed of retiring early, moving to California, a city he'd visited and fallen in love with, and finally writing full-time. On the 27th of July, 1985, Mel left work and stopped by a local restaurant, where he stayed for about an hour. Witnesses said he seemed to be in unusually high spirits. He mentioned he had plans for the following morning. He was going to meet an old friend and go swimming at Edgewater Park, along the shores of Lake Erie. There was just one problem with that plan. Mel Wiley did not swim. He wasn't an outdoorsman. He wasn't even a fan of being outside for long. So the idea of him driving 20 miles out of his way to spend a morning in the water struck almost everyone who knew him as completely out of character. 3 days later, at around 4 o'clock in the morning, park rangers discovered his car. A tan, 1980 Toyota station wagon, parked alone, locked, at Lakefront State Park. Inside, everything was folded with almost unsettling neatness: his clothes, his wallet, his police identification, his badge, a bottle of sunscreen, a beach towel, and a pack of cigarettes. Everything a man would leave behind if he only planned to step into the lake for an afternoon swim. Except Mel Wiley never came back for any of it. Search and rescue teams combed the surrounding park and dragged the nearby waters for days. They found absolutely nothing. And that, according to investigators, was the detail that didn't sit right. In the middle of summer, a drowning victim's body doesn't simply vanish, it rises to the surface within days. So if he hadn't drowned in Lake Erie, where exactly was Mel Wiley? Detective Jim Bigham had known Wiley since the 1970s, when the two of them worked together at the county sheriff's office. He didn't buy the drowning theory for a second. And once he started digging into his old friend's apartment, the picture only became stranger. The apartment was immaculate. Food and water had been left out for his two cats, the kind of thing a man does when he expects to be home soon, not the kind of thing a man does when he's planning to vanish forever. But some of his belongings were conspicuously missing. His long-sleeved shirts, the ones he wore religiously, even in the middle of summer, to hide scarring on his arms, were gone from his closet. And the manuscript for his half-finished novel, the project he poured so much of himself into, was nowhere to be found. Neither was his published book of poetry. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere. No indication that anything had gone wrong. Big Am began to form a theory of his own, one that had nothing to do with an accident, and nothing to do with foul play. He believed Mel Wiley wanted people to think he had drowned. Inside the apartment, Big Am found a receipt for a dry cleaner. When he went to investigate it, he discovered something curious tucked inside the pockets of the clothes Wiley had left behind for cleaning: bus schedules, taxi numbers, a brochure for train travel. One of the train stations listed was less than 100 yards from the very park where his car was found. As Big Am himself would later put it, in an interview with the LA Times, "We investigated it like a homicide, but homicide doesn't add up. Suicide doesn't add up. A gangland killing doesn't add up. Kidnapping doesn't add up either." With so few solid leads, the investigation began to stall. That's when a department dispatcher made a discovery that would eventually crack the case wide open. She had noticed Wiley behaving strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, leaving work early, seeming distracted, spending almost every shift alone at his desk, hunched over his typewriter. Curious, she began quietly checking the contents of his office wastebasket. Investigators eventually pulled the ribbon from that same typewriter, and what it revealed changed everything. Imprinted on the ribbon was a letter, written to a married woman Wiley had apparently been secretly involved with. In it, he complained that she wouldn't leave her husband, and said there was little left for him in Hinckley Township anymore. He wrote that by the time she received his letter, he would already be thousands of miles away. His exact words, preserved on that ribbon, read, "Where I've gone is of no critical importance, and it's very doubtful I'll ever return. By the time you receive this, I will, in a sense, have gone away. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's a one-way trip, so I'm told, with no possibility of ever returning." When investigators eventually tracked down the woman in question, she insisted she had never actually received that letter. But there was one detail she couldn't explain away: she had closed the post office box the two of them used to communicate just days after Wiley disappeared. Big Am theorized that Wiley had written the letter, then thought better of sending it, deciding not to reveal his plans even to the woman he was involved with. Slowly, Big Am became convinced of something else entirely. "You have to work on the assumption he took himself out of the picture," Big Am said. "He was divorced with no children. There was no real reason to keep him here. He had the background and the ability to get lost if he wanted to. But the dispatcher had one more secret, and this one wouldn't become public for 6 full years. For months, she had quietly been collecting the discarded papers Wiley had thrown into his office wastebasket. What she found was disturbing: pages and pages of graphic, explicit writing, stories that featured not just Wiley himself, but real members of his own church congregation, some accompanied by crude drawings. Among the discarded papers was also an order form to obtain illicit material from an outside publisher. 200 pages of it, collected over the course of years. Suddenly, a very different motive began to take shape. If Wiley believed this secret was on the verge of coming out, to his elderly mother, to his church, to the entire town that trusted him as their chief of police, a quiet, permanent disappearance may have looked like the only way to avoid total public humiliation. Adding fuel to that theory, investigators later learned that a fellow patrolman had actually threatened to expose Wiley's affair with the married woman around the same time. Some residents of Hinckley Township never accepted this explanation. They pointed out Wiley was close with his elderly mother and would never abandon her. They noted his car had once belonged to his deceased brother and held enormous sentimental value. He was also nearing retirement, with a pension worth thousands of dollars waiting for him. But investigators ultimately concluded the evidence pointed one direction: Mel Wiley had very likely chosen to leave, and to never come back. The Hinckley Township police chief in the year 2020 summarized it best. "I am about as reasonably sure as I can be that Mel did not perish in Lake Erie," he said. "Mel staged his own disappearance and left the area. I believe he went to California, and could very well, to this day, still be alive. We don't know. We all have moments in our lives, I think, where we'd like to take off and disappear, go somewhere, and start over." Mel Wiley has never been found. He was last seen in Hinckley Township, Ohio, on the 28th of July, 1985. If he's still alive today, he would be well into his 80s. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here." I want to see who's truly following this shocking story all the way through, because the second case we're about to cover is even stranger than the first, and it involves something far darker than a simple disappearance. Antelope Valley, California. The morning of June the 11th, 1998. Jonathan Aujay was 38 years old, a K-9 unit dog handler with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and a former United States Army Special Forces paratrooper. By every account, he was an exceptionally experienced outdoorsman. He'd completed more than 10 climbing expeditions on Mount Whitney, regularly went camping on his weekends off, and was, in his spare time, a dedicated marathon runner. In fact, he was deep in training for an ultra-endurance race at the time of his disappearance. On this particular morning, his day off from work, he pulled his truck into the Devil's Punchbowl Natural Area, a rugged stretch of high desert around 60 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. He locked the truck, shouldered a green backpack, and set out for a long training run. He told his wife he'd be home by dark. He never came home again. Early into the run, Aujay crossed paths with a schoolteacher leading a group of young children through the park. He recognized them. It was a class he'd recently visited alongside his K-9 partner, a Belgian Malinois named Bosco, and he stopped to chat before continuing on his way, describing his planned route toward a nearby peak. A few hours later, 2 employees at a nearby camp spotted a man matching his description jogging farther into the wilderness. Then, around 6 o'clock that evening, a third employee saw him one final time, heading back in the direction of the parking lot. Shortly after that last sighting, a local resident reported hearing a single gunshot somewhere in the vicinity of the Punchbowl. The sun went down. Aujay never returned home. At 11 o'clock that night, his wife reported him missing, and sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, his truck was sitting exactly where he'd left it that morning. The search that followed was massive. Volunteers, additional search and rescue teams, a K-9 unit, helicopters, officers on horseback, all-terrain vehicles, and thermal imaging equipment were brought in over the following days. A former colleague who joined the search recalled the mood being cautiously optimistic at first. Aujay was, in his words, as tough as nails, and everyone assumed he'd be found with nothing worse than a sprained ankle. But as the days stretched on without a single trace of him, that optimism began to fade. What deputies found inside his truck troubled them from the very beginning. Sitting out in plain view on the center console was a .38 caliber revolver. The first deputy on scene would later describe the sight of that exposed weapon as, in his own words, not just a red flag, it's full-on fireworks. No experienced officer, he explained, leaves a firearm sitting out like that. And friends of Aujay confirmed something else strange: he never carried a gun while running. Not once. So why was it there? And more importantly, why hadn't he taken it with him? As investigators dug deeper into Aujay's personal life in the weeks that followed, a much more complicated picture began to emerge. Aujay and his wife had been high school sweethearts, on and off for years before finally settling down and getting married in 1986. Together they had one daughter, just 5 years old at the time of his disappearance. By the spring of 1998, the couple had begun quietly discussing a divorce. On the very morning of his final run, Aujay had reportedly suggested they separate for good. He'd already begun packing some of his belongings, including his running medals, and had returned a family heirloom to his in-laws. He'd also given a necklace that once belonged to his father to a woman named Vicky, a fellow marathon runner he'd grown close to in recent months. Vicky would go on to join the search for him herself. Just one day before he vanished, Aujay and his wife had attended their very first therapy session together, with a psychologist from the sheriff's department. During that session, they were both asked directly if they were feeling suicidal. Both said no. The therapist would later confirm to investigators that Aujay did not appear to be suicidal at the time. But his wife began having her own doubts, remembering his final words to her before he left the house that morning: "Have a nice life. Tell our daughter I love her." At first, she assumed those words were simply about the end of their marriage. But as time passed, she began to wonder if they were something else entirely, a final goodbye from a man who already knew he wasn't coming back. She also recalled an argument roughly a month earlier, during which Aujay had reportedly put a gun to his own temple in the car and angrily asked her, "What do you want me to do? Kill myself?" But not everyone in Aujay's life believed this darker theory. His older brother said that when the case was eventually ruled a suicide, he never believed it, not for a single minute. His nephew agreed, saying Aujay had far too much pride for that to be the explanation. A close friend added that the last time they'd spoken, Aujay seemed genuinely excited about his new relationship with Vicky, describing him as having, in his words, a zest for life. Family members pointed to his deep bond with his young daughter, his strong sense of duty, and the meticulous care he put into his job. He reportedly polished his boots and badge twice a week and prided himself on giving everything he had to his position. To them, it simply didn't add up that a man like that would walk away from his daughter without a single word of explanation. Just days after Aujay vanished, an entirely different theory came to light, one that had nothing to do with his marriage, and everything to do with what he might have stumbled across out in that desert. A woman with reported ties to a local biker gang came forward, claiming she'd heard that Aujay had stumbled onto a methamphetamine lab during his run, and had been, in her words, taken care of. Shortly after, another informant came forward independently, telling investigators much the same story, that a local drug dealer had disposed of Aujay after he found something he wasn't supposed to see. By the year 2000, a homicide investigator looking into the case had heard strikingly similar accounts from 9 additional individuals connected to the local drug trade. Now, this is the part of the story where things get genuinely unsettling, because what investigators uncovered next didn't just point toward a possible crime. It pointed toward a possible cover-up, inside Aujay's own department. If you've made it this far, stay with me, because this next part is exactly why this case remains unsolved to this day. One name kept coming up again and again in these accounts, a local deputy who patrolled the Antelope Valley region, alone, covering an area home to somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 residents. This deputy reportedly had links to several known methamphetamine dealers and manufacturers in the area. He lived only a few miles from the Devil's Punchbowl. And yet, despite being a fellow officer, he never once joined the massive search effort for Aujay. The homicide detective assigned to the case in the year 2000 discovered that a meth lab really had been operating close to the exact route Aujay regularly ran. He began building a case, hoping to obtain a warrant for this deputy's phone and financial records. But when he brought his findings to his superior, he was reportedly shut down immediately and told to drop the investigation, or risk losing his job entirely. The case was handed off to another detective, who ultimately concluded that Aujay had, in fact, taken his own life, closing the door on the corruption angle almost entirely. The original detective would later claim he overheard his captain instructing the new detective to take care of him on this. I want to be very clear here, because this detail matters. The deputy in question was never arrested. He was never formally charged with any crime connected to Aujay's disappearance, and he has consistently denied any involvement. What we do know, factually, is this: a documented meth lab operation existed along Aujay's running route, multiple independent informants named the same individual, a formal warrant request was blocked by a superior officer, and the detective who pursued that warrant was ultimately pushed off the case entirely. Whether that adds up to a cover-up, or simply a deeply flawed investigation, remains an open question to this day. A separate deputy, who spent years afterward trying to expose what he believed was corruption within the department, was eventually terminated from his position, officially over paperwork errors. He sued the department for wrongful termination and won, years later, after a lengthy legal battle. To this day, Jonathan Aujay's case remains officially classified by the department as a probable suicide. No arrest has ever been made, and no body has ever been recovered. The human cost of this case is almost as difficult to hear as the mystery itself. Because Aujay's body was never found, his wife had to wait 5 long years before a death certificate could even be issued. Only then could she finally access his pension and retirement benefits, but by that point, she had already lost the family home. Their daughter, the little girl he said goodbye to on that final morning, tragically passed away in the year 2020, at just 26 years old. Jonathan Aujay is still missing today. 2 officers. 2 disappearances, decades apart. 2 families who are, in some form, still waiting for real answers. If you have any information related to either of these cases, the official contact details are listed in the description box below. Please reach out to them directly, not to us. If this video kept you here until the very last second, that's exactly the kind of story we live for here at the Cold Case Archive. Hit that like button if you want to see more cases just like this one. Let us know in the comments which case stuck with you more. And if you haven't already subscribed, now is the perfect time, because we release a brand new unsolved case every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.